Who should get Warglaives? Who gets to join me in wearing sunglasses and a chain indoors and become the mega chad of their guild? That's right, it's finally time for us to touch on exactly what you've been waiting for this entire expansion. Who should get Warglaives and why? Should glaives go to your rogues or should they go to your warriors? Should they go to the player instead of the class? Should you give one to one class and the other and let them duel it out or fight for it and see which other one drops? Or should you always complete the pair? Now, before I dive in, a quick disclaimer, I personally am a huge fan of rogues. Obviously, it being my favorite class throughout all of Classic, and in my opinion, Warglaives were designed aesthetically and as well just stats-wise with rogues in mind. But I do have to say this video is going to touch on everything from player versus class to how it affects each individual class. And if you're in a situation where you think you deserve it, always just make the case and make the argument for it, because whoever cares about what you see on the internet or what people see as better? In all honesty, whatever guild situation you're in is all that really matters, and your social dynamic with your raiders as well as with your players. Basically, this video isn't exactly telling you who you should give it to. What it's doing is telling you what are the things you want to take into consideration for your own unique situation, and only necessarily focus on the things that matter to you guys. So with that being said, let's dive right in. Now, there's a lot to consider here, but the first thing I want to stress to you guys is this golden rule. Always complete the pair. Don't be the guild that has one main hand on one character and one offhand on the other character when you could have easily just completed the pair and then gotten the next person the next set of glaives. This is going to massively hinder your guild more than it is going to appease these two players. So once you decide who's getting it first, just make sure you complete the pair. All right. Now we've got all of the questions you need to be considering when looking at giving out Warglaives in your guild. Now, the first thing is the player versus the class. I'll dive into the reasons why each class wants these glaives and how much it improves their DPS, but first you have to take a consideration into who is the player. Do you have a player that does more DPS for you within your guild? Let's be realistic, guys. Your GM is probably a rogue. Your raid leader might even be a rogue. And if you're in this sort of situation, or even if you have a rogue in your raid group in general, you're probably looking more towards player versus class than you are looking towards what's the biggest DPS increase for your raid overall. There's always going to be cases in every guild where one person is carrying a lot of the weight of the actual guild itself. Now, what I mean is the roster boss has been absolutely crushing people in TBC. And if you're not in the position of power to realize how much effort goes into organizing raids every week and making sure you have enough people to even do the raids every week for this entire expansion, you probably don't realize just how much effort goes into that. Now, do I think someone should get directly rewarded for that? That's not for me to decide. That's for your guild to decide what's more important to your guild. There are also the considerations if people show up and do more damage than others. Now, there are situations out here where rogues are doing significantly more DPS, either single target or even throughout the entire raid, than any of the warriors. And if you're looking at player versus class, you also have to consider greatly, do you have rogues that are focused on PvPing? If you have rogues that have been struggling for Gladiator, or if you have people that are rank 1s in your guild, more likely than not, they're very aggressively hunting down these weapons, and it means a massive amount to them. Now, the last thing to mention for the player, I would say, is probably, is your rogue playing Expose Armor, and has he been the Expose Armor player throughout the entirety of TBC? If so, he's been playing a support class for all of TBC, probably for a reason to try to get Warglaives and live out this class fantasy. I would always take this into consideration, and you've probably already had that conversation if you have a rogue in your raid in general. Okay, now that we've talked about the player and all of the considerations to give if you're choosing player versus class, now let's dive into the class itself, rogue versus warrior. Warglaives are a massive DPS increase for both rogue and warrior. It's not even close currently in this phase. Although in Sunwell, both of these classes have relatively competitive other options if they don't have both of these weapons. So how do we decide which one to give it to if we're looking in an objective manner? So if we're looking at it in a vacuum, where both players are the exact same person, but one is playing a warrior and one is playing a rogue. Which one actually helps the raid itself more? Now, if we look individually at one of the drops, mainly the offhand, we can see that it is 1.4 weapon speed. This means it is extremely fast, and a general rule of thumb for warriors is that you actually want a slower offhand in TBC because it scales better with your cleaves and whirlwinds. But this is a different situation when you're talking about single target DPS. This actually opens you up to something that's very simple to deal with if your guild is trying to decide between the warrior and the rogue. If the offhand drops first, you could give it to the rogues, and if the main hand drops first, you give it to the warriors. Now, why would the main hand dropping first, when it's equally as good for both classes, allow you to give it to the warriors? Well, unfortunately for us rogues, it's just a fact of TBC that warriors do more damage on overall DPS, as well as on single target fights, for now at least, within this expansion. So warriors as a class are inherently stronger than rogues within a raid situation. I know this is a huge bummer to hear if you're a rogue, but if you're in a situation where you're actually doing more DPS than your warriors in your guild, then that completely changes everything that I just said. That means you are playing at a significantly higher level than your warriors, and just right there, I think it automatically means you should deserve to get the Warglaives, unless there's external factors, again, like I talked about earlier, choosing the player who deserves it over the player who performs the best. So generally speaking, your best DPS and your most core player can be the person getting the glaives. Now, the next thing to think about between the two classes inherently, if they're equal here, is which class does more overall damage throughout a raid. Unfortunately, rogues are limited on cleave with their 2-minute CD blade flurry. It is one of the most powerful cooldowns in the entire game, but you can only use it once every 2 minutes. And after testing Black Temple, it seems like we're going to be moving a lot faster than we did in tier 5, so uptime of cleave is actually going to scale significantly higher throughout these raids. Now, on single target with Warglaives, rogues are finally going to be catching up to these warriors and actually beating a lot of the DPS in your raids. But again, arguing for cleave to be a reason why warriors should get Warglaives is a bit counterproductive, because again, that offhand is too fast to be amazing for cleave situations. The difference here is if the 200 attack power against demons and the haste proc can make it even stronger than having a slow weapon in your offhand. If not, warriors might actually have to switch to a slow weapon while doing trash to have more cleave damage, and then switch back to the Warglaives for boss fights. But the proc and the set bonus being as powerful as they are make up for that weapon speed. But does this situation even matter to your guild? You really need to take a step back and ask yourself, does this actually affect you as a guild? If you're not in a hardcore guild that's fighting for world first or racing for world records or trying to parse as much as possible, then looking at it purely between warrior versus rogue and which class benefits the raid's overall DPS slightly more doesn't actually mean anything. If the warrior does 100 more DPS throughout the entire raid, or if the rogue does 100 more DPS throughout the entire raid, how does that actually affect you guys at all? And to be honest, if you're in one of these top tier guilds, you guys already know who's getting your Warglaives. Now, every guild is in a different situation, and I think that is the biggest stressor here with this video. Your guild shouldn't decide on these weapons the same way every other guild does, because you should take into consideration who deserves it within your guild, who PvPs, who leads, who's been putting in the most effort, who brings the most to the raids or brings the most morale to the guild in general. There's all of these things to consider, and there's no one definitive answer unless you are in this exact situation where you're in a vacuum trying to do the most DPS and racing for speedruns. If there was other things to consider that I forgot, make sure to let me know in the comments so that everyone can read them and see them as well. And again, if you want to check out any of the Black Temple loot prio, I went through everything in one of those corners. Thanks for watching, guys. Happy holidays, and I'll see you guys all on the next one.